You know, boys, life wasn't always like it is now. Back in my day, things were different. Rougher, maybe, but also full of moments I'll never forget. Let me tell you about something that happened when I was in the Army. It's a story I've never shared before, but maybe it's time. We were stationed at a camp in the middle of nowhere, dusty roads, the sound of boots hitting the ground, and the clinking of gear were part of daily life. Days were long and nights were quiet, except for the occasional howl of the wind or the distant sound of artillery practice. We had a routine, and routines kept us sane. One evening, while I was going through my gear, checking straps, oiling my rifle, and tightening the buckles on my boots, I found something odd. Tucked into a side pocket of my bag was a piece of paper, folded so neatly it didn't seem like it belonged there. At first, I thought it was a list or some instructions I'd missed, but when I opened it, there was a map, a hand-drawn one. It was rough, but clear enough to show some kind of trail leading out of the camp into the wilderness. And there was a note. It wasn't long, just a few words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Follow this to live. Don't trust anyone. Now, imagine finding something like that. At first, I thought it was a prank, something one of the guys cooked up to mess with me. But the handwriting didn't match anyone I knew, and something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I mean, who leaves a note like that in someone's gear without a good reason? I sat there for a while, staring at the map and the note. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, crumple it up, and toss it away. But something deep inside told me not to. I folded it back up and slipped it into my jacket pocket, trying not to look suspicious. You've got to understand, in the Army, trust is everything. If you start acting strange, people notice. That night, I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions. Who put the map there? Why me? Was this some kind of warning, or worse, a setup? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The guys were joking around, sharing stories and going about their duties. But for me, nothing felt the same. Every glance felt like someone was watching me. Every laugh felt like it was aimed at me. And that map. It burned a hole in my pocket all day long. You boys might think it's easy to brush off something like that, but when you're out there, with nothing but your instincts to rely on, you learn to trust your gut. And my gut was telling me that this was just the beginning of something big, something I wasn't ready for. So that's how it started. Just a map and a note. Funny how the smallest things can turn your whole world upside down, isn't it? Now, the first thing you need to understand about that map is that it wasn't some fancy, detailed chart. It was rough, like something scribbled in a hurry, with lines for trails and a few marks for landmarks. One thing stood out, though. A circle. A big one drawn right near the edge of what I knew to be our patrol zone. That's where it was leading me. But here's the thing, boys. In the Army, stepping out of bounds, even just a little, can get you into a world of trouble. And if you're caught sneaking around with a map that says, "Don't trust anyone," well, let's just say explaining that wouldn't go over too well. So I kept quiet. All day, I tried to act normal. I cleaned my rifle, joined the guys for chow, and even laughed at the dumb jokes they always told. But inside, my mind was racing. Every time I glanced at someone, I wondered, are they watching me? Do they know? It was exhausting. That evening, when things quieted down, I finally had a chance to really look at the map. I spread it out on my bunk and studied it under the dim light of a lantern. It showed a trail leading out of the camp, past the old supply depot, and into the woods. The circle was marked at the end of that trail. What was out there? I had no idea. And then there was the note. Don't trust anyone. That part gnawed at me. Did that mean my own unit? My friends? Or was it someone outside the camp? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. But no answers. As I sat there, lost in thought, one of the guys, Jenkins, a real chatterbox, poked his head into the tent. "Hey, old man," he said, grinning. "Yeah, they called me old man even back then. You're gonna miss the card game. You coming or what?" I folded up the map so fast you'd think it was on fire. Yeah, I said, slipping it into my pocket. "I'll be there in a minute." Jenkins gave me a look, like he could tell something was up. "You sure you're all right? You've been acting kinda weird today." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." He didn't push it, but as he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something. That maybe somehow he knew. And if he did, who else might? That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the map, the note, and that circle. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, but another part, the part that got me through every tough spot I'd ever faced, kept saying, "You have to know. You have to find out." By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going to follow the map. I didn't know what I'd find, but I couldn't let it go. Not yet. Now, boys, let me tell you, when you've got something as strange as a secret map burning a hole in your pocket, it's hard to look at anyone the same way. Everyone's either a potential ally or a possible enemy, and you start questioning things you'd normally ignore. That morning, as I packed up my gear and went about my usual routine, Jenkins kept hanging around. You remember Jenkins, the chatterbox? He was always the kind of guy who couldn't leave well enough alone. "You've been quiet lately, old man. What's eating you?" he asked as we scrubbed down the barracks. "Nothing," I said, maybe a little too quickly. "Just tired." But he didn't buy it. "You sure? You're not getting spooked out here, are you?" he said with a laugh. "I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere, but it's not haunted or anything." I forced a chuckle. Yeah, just didn't sleep well." Now, the thing about Jenkins is he liked to dig. Not in a bad way, but he just couldn't let a mystery go. And me acting weird? That was enough to get him curious. All day, he kept finding excuses to be near me, whether it was during chow, cleaning weapons, or even during the evening drill. I had to be careful. If he found out about the map, there was no telling what he'd do. Later that evening, I decided to take a closer look at the map again. I waited until everyone was busy. Some guys were playing cards, others were catching up on sleep. I slipped into the storage tent where it was quieter and pulled out the map. I traced the trail with my finger, imagining what might be out there. The circle at the end still didn't make sense. Was it a location? A warning? Or maybe a trap? As I was deep in thought, I heard footsteps. I quickly folded the map and stuffed it into my pocket just as Jenkins walked in. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusing. "Nothing," I said. "Just needed a minute to think." He raised an eyebrow. "In the storage tent?" "What can I say? It's quiet," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Jenkins didn't say anything for a moment, but his eyes lingered on me like he was trying to read my mind. Finally, he shrugged. "All right, old man. Just don't go getting lost in your thoughts." After he left, I realized I couldn't keep this up. If I didn't make a move soon, someone, maybe Jenkins, maybe someone else, would figure out something was going on. I had to act, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone I could trust. That's when I thought of Rodriguez. He wasn't the kind to ask too many questions, and he had a good head on his shoulders. If anyone could help me figure this out, it was him. But asking for help meant taking a risk. Could I really trust him? Or would I just be digging myself deeper into trouble? Boys, let me tell you, sometimes the hardest part of a mission isn't the danger or the enemy. It's figuring out who you can trust when everything's on the line. Now, boys, this is where things started to heat up. That evening, we got orders for a night drill. Nothing unusual at first. Drills were common, especially in the middle of nowhere. It kept us sharp. But something about this one felt off. We were told to pack light and move fast, heading out to the north perimeter. I couldn't help but notice that the trail we were taking matched a part of the map. Not exactly, but close enough to set my nerves on edge. What were the odds? Rodriguez and I ended up in the same squad for the drill, which was a small relief. He was steady, calm, and didn't ask too many questions. Jenkins, on the other hand, was in another group, and honestly, that was fine by me. He had a knack for sticking his nose where it didn't belong. As we moved through the darkness, the air felt heavier than usual, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The only sounds were our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional crackle of a radio. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I had that map and note tucked into my pocket, and they felt heavier with every step. Halfway through the drill, we hit a clearing, a perfect spot for a mock ambush. But before the officers could even give the order, the ground shook. A deafening explosion lit up the night sky, throwing dirt and debris everywhere. We hit the ground, instincts taking over. My ears rang and my chest felt like it was caved in, but I managed to push myself up, yelling, "Everyone, stay down." The explosion came from ahead, near where our path was supposed to end. Chaos erupted. Radios crackled with overlapping voices, orders shouted over screams. I scanned the area trying to figure out what had happened. My first thought was enemy fire, but this wasn't a war zone. At least it wasn't supposed to be. Rodriguez grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back behind a tree. "What the hell was that?" he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the ringing in my ears. "I don't know," I said, but deep down I couldn't ignore the thought gnawing at me. This was too close to the map's trail to be a coincidence. We regrouped as best we could, but one of the squads was missing. Jenkins' squad. The officers were barking orders to fan out and search for them. My gut screamed that this was a bad idea. Splitting up after an explosion in the middle of the night? That was asking for trouble. But orders were orders. Rodriguez and I stuck together as we searched the area. The clearing gave way to dense trees, the kind that swallowed light and sound. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. My rifle felt heavier in my hands, my senses stretched to their limits. Then we found it. Near a burned patch of ground, partially covered by dirt and debris, was a marker, just like the ones on the map. It was small, made of metal, and engraved with strange symbols I couldn't make sense of. I crouched down to get a better look, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" Rodriguez asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I said, slipping it into my pocket. "But it shouldn't be here." Before we could make sense of it, the radio crackled to life. "All units, return to base. Repeat, return to base immediately." We didn't need to be told twice. Whatever this was, the officers wanted us back at camp fast. As we double-timed it back, I couldn't help but feel like we were leaving something behind, something important. When we got back to camp, the mood was grim. Jenkins' squad still hadn't returned, and no one had answers about the explosion. I kept my mouth shut about the marker. I didn't trust anyone enough to share it. Not yet. That night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't sleep. The marker, the explosion, the map, it all felt connected. And the fact that Jenkins was missing, that only made things worse. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't just some random drill gone wrong. Boys, let me tell you, that was the moment I knew I was in over my head. But turning back, that wasn't an option anymore. Not with what I'd seen. Not with what I was starting to piece together. Now, boys, if you think the story was strange so far, you haven't heard anything yet. The morning after the explosion, the camp was quieter than usual. You'd think the officers would be running drills to figure out what happened. But no one was talking. It was like they wanted us to pretend nothing happened. And Jenkins still missing. Not a single word about him or his squad. I couldn't stop thinking about that marker. It sat heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder that something bigger was going on. I knew I couldn't let it go, but I also couldn't just charge into the unknown without a plan. So I made a decision. I was going to follow the map, alone. Rodriguez would have been the obvious choice to bring along, but the less he knew, the safer he'd be. If this went sideways, and it probably would, I didn't want him caught in the crossfire. So that night, I packed light, a canteen, a few rations, my knife, and my rifle, and of course, the map. The camp was quiet as I slipped out. The moon was high, casting just enough light to guide me without needing a flashlight. My heart raced with every step, but I kept moving. The trail on the map was clear enough, and the first landmark, a crooked tree that looked like it had been struck by lightning, was easy to spot. From there, the path led deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the camp faded until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but shadows. After about an hour, I reached the second landmark, an old supply depot, or at least what was left of it. The place was abandoned, half buried in the earth like it had been forgotten for decades. Rusted barrels and broken crates littered the ground, and the air smelled of damp wood and decay. I searched the area, following the map's markings. Near the corner of the depot, and I found the trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of rotting planks. My gut told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I cleared the debris and pried it open. The ladder led down into darkness, the kind where even a flashlight barely makes a dent. I climbed down, one hand on my rifle, ready for anything. The air was damp and stale, and the walls were lined with rusted metal. At the bottom, I found a small room. It was empty, except for a table in the center, and on that table, a box. The box was small, metal, and locked. But here's the strange part. It had the same symbols as the marker I'd found the night before. Whatever this was, it was connected. I picked it up, and it was heavier than it looked. My first instinct was to open it, but the lock was solid, and I didn't have the tools to break it. Just as I was about to head back up, I heard something. Footsteps. Faint, but unmistakable. My heart stopped. I clicked off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the narrow passage. Whoever or whatever it was, they were coming closer. My mind raced with possibilities. A soldier from camp. Someone who'd been watching me? Or something worse? The footsteps stopped just outside the room. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a voice whispered, low and chilling, "You shouldn't have come here." Boys, I'll be honest with you. I've faced a lot in my life, but nothing ever froze me in place like that voice did. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, just like that, the footsteps started again, fading into the distance. I waited a long time before climbing back up. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. Whoever or whatever that was, they knew I was there. And they wanted me to know it too. When I got back to the surface, the woods felt even darker, the air heavier. I made my way back to camp, clutching that box like my life depended on it. And maybe it did. Now, boys, you'd think that after a night like that, I'd have turned back. That I'd have handed over the map, the marker, and the box to the officers and called it a day. But if you've been listening, you know me better than that. I had to see this through, no matter what. Only problem was, I wasn't the only one out there anymore. The morning after my little midnight adventure, I barely had time to catch my breath. Camp was abuzz with rumors. Jenkins' squad still hadn't returned, and there were whispers about strange lights in the woods. The officers didn't say a word, but you could see it in their eyes. They were just as rattled as the rest of us. Something wasn't right, and they knew it. I kept my head down, acting like everything was normal. The box was hidden under my bunk, wrapped in an old shirt. I didn't dare open it. Not yet. But I knew I couldn't leave it there for long. If someone found it, I'd have a lot of explaining to do, and none of it would end well for me. By nightfall, I made up my mind. I'd leave camp again, follow the map further, and try to figure out what was going on. This time, I packed even lighter. Just my knife, the map, and the box. I didn't want anything slowing me down. The woods were quieter than usual that night. No wind, no distant calls of wildlife. Just an eerie, suffocating silence. I followed the map's trail, my eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a snap of a twig, a rustle of leaves. But when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. Then, about an hour in, I saw it. A faint light, flickering through the trees. My first thought was another squad, maybe a search party. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't coming from a flashlight or a fire. It was something else entirely, something unnatural. The light seemed to pulse like it was alive, and it sent a chill down my spine. I crouched low, moving as quietly as I could. When I got close enough, I saw what was causing it. A strange device about the size of a backpack sitting in the middle of a clearing. It was covered in the same symbols as the box and the marker. The light was coming from a panel on its side, glowing softly. Before I could make sense of it, I heard them. Footsteps coming from the other side of the clearing. I dropped to the ground, pressing myself against the base of a tree. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They moved with purpose, like they knew exactly what they were looking for. One of them knelt by the device, fiddling with the panel, while the other kept watch. I held my breath, hoping the darkness would keep me hidden. But then the one standing turned in my direction, their head tilting slightly, like they'd heard something. I didn't wait to find out. Slowly, started backing away, keeping my movements as quiet as possible. But luck wasn't on my side. My foot hit a loose rock, and the sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Both figures snapped their heads toward me. "Go!" One of them shouted, their voice sharp and urgent. The other grabbed the device, hoisting it over their shoulder, and they took off into the woods. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was a blur as I weaved through the trees, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and them. But they were fast, faster than anyone I'd ever seen. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps closing in. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I didn't stop. Finally, I saw it, a rocky outcrop jutting out of the hillside. I scrambled up the rocks, finding a narrow crevice just big enough to squeeze into. I pressed myself against the cold stone, trying to calm my breathing as their footsteps grew louder. They stopped just outside the crevice. I could see their shadows moving against the trees, hear their labored breaths. One of them spoke, their voice low and tense. "He's close. Keep looking." For what felt like an eternity, they searched the area. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Eventually, their footsteps faded, and the forest fell silent once more. I waited another hour before crawling out, my muscles stiff and my heart still racing. When I finally made it back to camp, the sun was just beginning to rise. I collapsed onto my bunk, clutching the box like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a game anymore. Someone, or something, didn't want me to know the truth. But the more they pushed, the more I knew I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Boys, you ever have one of those moments where the world feels just a little too quiet? Like even the air's afraid to make a sound? That's how it felt the next night. After what had happened out in the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not just by the officers or the other soldiers, but by something else. Something I couldn't see. The day passed in a haze. I kept my head down, going through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. The box was still hidden under my bunk, and the map was folded neatly in my jacket pocket. Every now and then, I caught Rodriguez or Jenkins, or what was left of him in my thoughts, glancing my way. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe they really did notice something different about me. That night, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. "Run before it finds you." I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. The barracks were dark, the other guys sound asleep. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But then there it was again, closer this time. "Run." I grabbed my rifle and swung my legs off the bunk, my eyes scanning the room. Nothing. Just the usual shadows cast by the moonlight streaming through the windows. But the whisper didn't stop. It moved, circling me, the words repeating over and over like a broken record. By now, I wasn't just scared. I was angry. "Who's there?" I hissed, my voice barely louder than the whisper itself. No answer. Just the same maddening voice. "Run. Run before it finds you." I grabbed my jacket and slipped outside, rifle in hand. The air was cold and still, and the camp was silent except for the faint hum of the generator. I scanned the perimeter, expecting to see... Well, I didn't know what I expected, but there was nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the storage tent. My instincts kicked in, and I crept closer, keeping low and quiet. The tent flap rustled in the breeze, and I could just make out a shadow moving inside. My grip on the rifle tightened. "Who's there?" I said again, louder this time. The whisper stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then from inside the tent, a voice answered. "Too late." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I raised my rifle and stepped inside, ready for anything. But the tent was empty. Just the same old crates and supplies. My heart pounded in my ears as I backed out, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bunk, rifle across my lap, my eyes locked on the door. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The next morning, things got worse. Jenkins' squad had officially been declared missing, and the officers were on edge. Patrols were doubled, and everyone was warned to stay in groups. But no one said a word about the explosion or the strange events in the woods. It was like they were trying to pretend none of it had happened. I couldn't let it go. That whisper, those words, they weren't random. Someone or something was trying to warn me. But about what? And why me? As the day went on, I kept catching snippets of conversations. Guys talking about seeing strange lights at night, hearing things they couldn't explain. It wasn't just me. Whatever was happening, it was spreading. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a decision. I couldn't sit around and wait for answers. I had the map, the marker, and the box. Somewhere out there was the truth, and I was going to find it. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. "Rodriguez," I said, pulling him aside after chow. "I need your help." He frowned, crossing his arms. "What kind of help?" I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. "I can't explain everything right now, but something's going on. Out in the woods. I need to go back, and I need someone to watch my back." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "You're serious, aren't you?" "Dead serious." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, old man, but you owe me an explanation when this is over." I nodded. "Deal." That night, as we packed our gear and prepared to head out, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The whispering voice, the missing squad, the strange lights, they were all connected. And whatever was waiting for us out there, it wasn't going to let us walk away without a fight. Now, boys, this is where things got real. Rodriguez and I set out just after midnight, keeping to the shadows as we slipped past the camp perimeter. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath, and the forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. The map was our guide, and I kept it close, checking it under the soft glow of a red-filtered flashlight. It led us deeper into the woods, past landmarks I'd recognized from my earlier trips. The crooked tree, the burned-out supply depot, they were all there just as marked. But this time the trail seemed different, like it had shifted, or maybe I was just seeing it with new eyes. Rodriguez didn't say much as we moved. He was steady, focused, his rifle at the ready. But I could tell he was uneasy. "You sure about this, old man?" he finally whispered. "Not even a little," I admitted, "but I've got to see it through." About an hour in, we reached the clearing where I'd seen the device the night before. The ground was disturbed, the grass flattened like something heavy had been dragged away. But the device was gone. "Someone's been here," Rodriguez said, crouching to examine the tracks. "Recently." I nodded, my eyes scanning the tree line. The symbols from the box and the marker were etched into the ground, faint but unmistakable. They formed a strange pattern, like a map of their own. "We keep moving," I said. The trail led us to a narrow ravine, where the forest opened up to reveal an abandoned bunker, half buried in the hillside. The entrance was sealed with a rusted metal door, but the symbols were carved into it, just like the ones on the box. "This is it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Rodriguez gave me a wary look. "And what exactly is it?" "Something I wish I didn't have to find." We pried the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, carrying the metallic tang of rust and decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing long-forgotten equipment, scattered papers, and walls covered in more of those symbols. The further we went, the stranger it got. There were rooms filled with old machinery, humming faintly like they were still alive. Crates marked with military insignia sat unopened, their contents a mystery. But the worst was the documents, files scattered across a desk in what looked like a command center. Rodriguez picked one up, scanning the pages. His face went pale. This doesn't make any sense." "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. He handed me the file, his hand trembling. The pages were filled with diagrams and reports, experiments, operations, things that shouldn't have existed, but they did. The words human trials and classified jumped out at me, along with a list of names. Names I recognized. Jenkins' name was at the top. "This can't be real," Rodriguez said. "What the hell were they doing out here?" "Something they didn't want anyone to know about," I said, "and something they're still trying to hide." Before we could process it, the sound of footsteps echoed through the bunker. Heavy boots moving fast. We killed our flashlights and ducked behind a stack of crates, our rifles at the ready. The footsteps grew louder, and then voices low and urgent. Whoever they weren't from our camp. Their words were muffled, but I caught fragments. "Find it, move fast, no witnesses." Rodriguez and I exchanged a look, and I could see the question in his eyes. "What do we do?" I pointed toward a back exit marked on the map and mouthed, "Go." We slipped through the shadows, moving as quietly as we could. The voices faded as we made our way down a narrow passage that led to the surface. But just as we reached the exit, a figure stepped into view, blocking our path. "Drop your weapons," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. We froze, our rifles trained on him. He wasn't wearing any insignias, just black tactical gear and a mask that hid his face. "What do you want?" I demanded. "The box," he said. "And the map?" "Now." Rodriguez glanced at me, his finger hovering over the trigger. I shook my head. We couldn't take the risk. Not yet. Slowly, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the box. "Here," I said, holding it out. "Take it." The man stepped closer, his hand outstretched. But before he could grab it, Rodriguez moved. In one swift motion, he shoved the man aside and fired a shot, the sound deafening in the confined space. "Run!" Rodriguez shouted. We bolted, the sound of gunfire and shouting chasing us as we sprinted into the woods. My heart pounded as we weaved through the trees, the darkness our only cover. Somehow, we managed to lose them, collapsing behind a fallen log to catch our breath. "You didn't have to do that," I said, clutching the box tightly. Rodriguez gave me a grim look. "Yeah, I did. Whatever's in that box, they want it bad, and that means we can't let them have it." He was right. Whatever we'd stumbled into, it was bigger than either of us, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. Boys, if I thought the bunker was bad, what came next was worse. After that narrow escape, Rodriguez and I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that box, it was dangerous, and the people after it weren't going to stop. The map, the box, the whispers, they were all part of something bigger, something we barely understood. We didn't go back to camp. It wasn't safe. Instead, we found a small clearing deep in the woods where we could lay low and figure out our next move. The box sat between us like a bomb waiting to go off. "You gonna open it?" Rodriguez asked, wiping sweat from his brow. I hesitated. "Not yet. Not until we know more." The map showed one more location, a circle deeper into the wilderness, far from any patrol routes or known landmarks. If the first two spots were anything to go by, this one was bound to be worse. But we didn't have a choice. The answers we needed were out there, and so was the truth. We rested for a couple of hours, then set off before dawn. The trail was rough, winding through dense undergrowth and rocky terrain. The forest grew darker and quieter the further we went, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. By midday, we reached the edge of a ravine. A narrow path led down to the bottom, where the map showed the next marker. But as we started the descent, a strange feeling washed over me, like we were being watched. "Do you feel that?" I asked, glancing at Rodriguez. He nodded, his eyes scanning the cliffs above us. We're not alone. We moved faster, our hands never far from our rifles. At the bottom of the ravine, the air was damp and cold, and the ground was littered with old debris, scraps of metal, broken crates, and what looked like the remains of a tent. In the center of it all was a hatch, half buried in the dirt. The symbols were there, etched into the metal. This was it. "Help me with this," I said, kneeling to clear away the debris. Rodriguez joined me, and together we pried the hatch open. The air that rushed out was stale and sour, carrying the faint scent of decay. "This better be worth it," Rodriguez muttered as we climbed down the ladder into the darkness. The space below was unlike anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just a bunker. It was a lab. Rows of equipment lined the walls, their screens flickering with faint green light. Vials and test tubes stood on tables, some filled with strange glowing liquids. And on the far wall, a series of large cylindrical tanks loomed, their contents obscured by condensation. "What the hell is this place?" Rodriguez whispered. I didn't answer. My eyes were drawn to a desk in the corner, where a stack of files sat neatly arranged. I picked one up and flipped through the pages. It was worse than I'd imagined. The experiments, the subjects, the results, it was all there in black and white. "They were testing on people," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Soldiers, civilians, anyone they could get their hands on." Rodriguez cursed under his breath, his fists clenched. "And Jenkins?" I scanned the pages, my heart sinking as I found his name. He was part of it. My voice caught. They called it necessary collateral. Before we could process the horror of what we'd found, the sound of footsteps echoed through the lab. Heavy boots, moving fast. We killed our flashlights and ducked behind a row of equipment, our breaths shallow. The voices came next, sharp and urgent. "Sweep the area. They have to be here." I clutched the box tightly, my mind racing. How had they found us? Had they been following us this whole time? Rodriguez tapped my shoulder, motioning toward the far end of the lab where a narrow tunnel led deeper underground. I nodded, and we moved as quietly as we could, the voices growing fainter behind us. The tunnel was long and cramped, the air growing colder with every step. At the end, we found another room smaller, but no less disturbing. In the center was a pedestal, and on it sat another box, identical to the one we had. Rodriguez let out a low whistle. Two of them. I didn't answer. My hands trembled as I reached for the new box, the weight of it familiar yet alien. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. "Let's get out of here," Rodriguez said, his voice tight. We turned to leave, but the way back was blocked. A figure stood in the entrance, their face obscured by a mask. In their hand was a weapon I didn't recognize, sleek, black, and humming with energy. "Hand them over," the figure said, their voice calm but menacing. Rodriguez raised his rifle. Not a chance. The figure didn't flinch. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Those boxes, they're not meant for you." "Then who are they meant for?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the box. "For those who can control them," the figure said. "And you can't." The tension was electric, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then, without warning, the figure raised their weapon. A blinding flash filled the room, and everything went white. Boys, when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when the world's asleep. This was heavy, unnatural, like the air itself had stopped moving. My head throbbed, and my vision was blurry, but I could just make out Rodriguez lying a few feet away, his rifle clutched in his hand. "Rodriguez," I croaked, crawling toward him. "You all right?" He groaned and sat up, rubbing his head. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're still breathing, so I guess that's something." The room around us was dark, the glow from the symbols on the boxes the only light. The figure was gone, but the memory of their words lingered. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." They weren't wrong. Whatever these boxes were, they weren't just relics or tools, they were something far more dangerous. We didn't have much time to think. The sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel, sharp and deliberate. Whoever had been chasing us before wasn't done yet. "We need to move," I said, helping Rodriguez to his feet. I grabbed both boxes, their weight nearly doubling my load. Every instinct screamed to leave one behind, but something told me we'd need them both. We slipped into the tunnel, our flashlights off to avoid detection. The air was cold and damp, and the walls seemed to close in the further we went. My heart pounded as I replayed the figure's words in my head. Who were they? What did they want with these boxes? The tunnel ended at a small hatch that opened into the forest. We emerged into the night, the cold air biting at our skin. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting jagged shadows across the ground. But we didn't have time to admire the scenery. The footsteps were getting closer. "This way," Rodriguez whispered, motioning toward a dense thicket. We pushed through the underbrush, the branches clawing at our clothes. My legs burned, and the weight of the boxes was like carrying two anvils, but I didn't stop. Then, out of nowhere, a voice echoed through the trees. "You can't run forever." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was the same one I'd heard in the bunker, calm and unrelenting. It wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us like the forest itself was speaking. Rodriguez grabbed my arm. "Keep moving." We broke into a sprint, the voice following us with every step. The forest seemed alive, the trees shifting and bending as if trying to trap us. My lungs burned, and my vision blurred, but I didn't dare slow down. Finally, we burst into a clearing. In the center was a cabin, old, weathered, but standing. It wasn't on the map, and I had no idea who it belonged to, but it was shelter. "Inside," I said, rushing toward the door. Rodriguez hesitated, his eyes scanning the tree line, but he followed. We slammed the door shut and barricaded it with whatever we could find. A table, a chair, even an old bookshelf. The cabin was small, just one room with a cot, a wood stove, and a table covered in papers. A lantern hung from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I set the boxes on the table and collapsed into a chair, my chest heaving. "What now?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with fear. "We figure out what these are," I said, gesturing to the boxes. He frowned. "And if they find us before we do?" "Then we fight." I said, though I wasn't sure we'd stand a chance. We turned our attention to the boxes. The symbols on their surfaces glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I ran my fingers over them, searching for a way to open them. There was no latch, no hinge, just the strange markings. Rodriguez picked up one of the files from the table. "These look like schematics," he said, flipping through the pages. "But they're not in any language I've ever seen." "Let me see," I said, taking the papers. The symbols on the boxes matched the ones in the files. Diagrams showed the boxes connected to larger machines, their purpose unclear. But one phrase stood out, written in bold letters: "Containment required." "What does that mean?" Rodriguez asked. "I don't know," I said. "But whatever's in these boxes, it wasn't meant to be out here." Before we could make sense of it, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. A chill ran down my spine as the voice returned, louder this time. "You can't hide. Give them to us." The windows rattled and the door creaked under the pressure of something, or someone outside. Rodriguez raised his rifle, his hand steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Whatever happens," I said, gripping the box tightly, "we don't let them take these." The door burst open and shadows flooded the room, their forms twisting and shifting like smoke. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Chapter 11: Betrayal. Boys, if there's one thing you should always remember, it's this. The hardest battles aren't the ones you fight with your fists or your weapons. They're the ones where you have to face the truth about the people you trust. The shadows poured into the cabin like a living storm, swirling around us, blocking out the faint light of the moon. Rodriguez and I moved fast, firing into the darkness, but it was like trying to fight smoke. The bullets didn't stop them. They just reformed and kept coming. "Fall back," I shouted, grabbing one of the boxes. Rodriguez covered me as we pushed through a side door, bursting out into the cold night air. The forest was alive with movement, shadows weaving through the trees, their whispers echoing all around us. "You can't escape. Give them to us." We ran, our breath clouding in the frigid air, the weight of the boxes dragging me down. I could feel the exhaustion creeping in, but I didn't dare slow. Rodriguez was right behind me, his eyes scanning the tree line, his rifle ready. "Where do we go?" he yelled. "I don't know," I shouted back. "Just keep moving." We stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller, surrounded by dense trees. It felt like the shadows were closing in, pressing us into a corner. My mind raced, searching for a plan, any plan to get us out alive. Then I heard it. A low hum, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the boxes. I stopped, setting them down on the ground. The symbols on their surfaces were glowing brighter, pulsing in time with the hum. "What's happening?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with panic. "I don't know," I said, kneeling beside the boxes. "But I think they're reacting to each other." The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath us started to tremble. The air around the boxes shimmered like heat rising off asphalt, and the symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Then it happened. A blinding flash erupted from the boxes, and for a moment, everything was still. The shadows stopped moving, the forest fell silent, and the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. And then I saw them. Figures stepping out from the trees. But these weren't the shadowy creatures we've been fighting. These were people, men in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. At least a dozen of them, their weapons trained on us. "Drop the boxes," one of them commanded, his voice cold and steady. "Now." Rodriguez raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Not a chance. The man took a step forward. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Those boxes aren't yours. Hand them over, and you might just walk out of here alive." Rodriguez glanced at me, his eyes asking a question I didn't have an answer to. But before I could speak, the hum from the boxes changed, growing higher pitched, almost frantic. The light from the symbols pulsed faster, casting strange, flickering shadows across the clearing. The men in tactical gear shifted uneasily, their weapons still trained on us. "This is your last chance," the leader said. "Like hell it is," Rodriguez muttered, and then everything went to hell. The hum from the boxes reached a crescendo, and another blinding flash lit up the clearing. When my vision cleared, the tactical team was in chaos. Some of them were on the ground, clutching their heads, while others were shouting orders, trying to regroup. The shadows returned more furious than before, crashing into the men like a tidal wave. "Go," Rodriguez shouted, grabbing one of the boxes. I didn't argue. We ran, leaving the chaos behind, but the weight of everything, of the boxes, of the danger, of the truth, was crushing me. And then it hit me. A single thought, sharp and cold. How did they find us? We kept running until we found another thicket to hide in, the sound of chaos fading into the distance. Rodriguez set the box down, his breath ragged. That was close. Too close, I said, still trying to catch my breath. How did they know where we were? Rodriguez looked at me, his face unreadable. What are you saying? I hesitated, my mind racing. I'm saying someone tipped them off. His expression darkened. You think it was me? I don't know, I snapped. But someone knew exactly where to find us, and it wasn't a coincidence. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. I've had your back this whole time. If I wanted to hand you over, I could have done it 100 times by now. Then how do you explain this? I asked, gesturing to the boxes. They keep finding us no matter where we go. How? For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the boxes, still glowing faintly in the dark. Then Rodriguez shook his head. You're paranoid, old man. Maybe you've been holding on to these boxes too long. Maybe they're messing with your head. Or maybe, I said, my voice cold, you're not who I thought you were. The silence between us was heavy, the weight of distrust settling like a stone. Finally, Rodriguez grabbed his rifle and stood. Think whatever you want, he said. But if you don't trust me, maybe we shouldn't be doing this together. And just like that, he walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I wanted to call him back, to fix whatever had just broken between us, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I wasn't sure if I could trust him anymore. I sat there alone, the boxes glowing softly at my feet, and wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But there was no time for regrets. The truth was still out there, and I had to find it, even if it meant doing it alone. Chapter 12. The Hidden Base. Boys, let me tell you, being alone in those woods with those boxes wasn't just lonely. It was terrifying. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt like someone, or something, was coming for me. And maybe they were. Rodriguez walking away hurt more than I cared to admit. But I couldn't dwell on it. I had to keep moving. The map showed one last location. It was deeper into the wilderness, past any point I'd ever been. The path wasn't marked with clear trails anymore, just vague landmarks and rough sketches. Still, I pressed on, each step pulling me closer to something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. After hours of trekking through the forest, I came to it. A massive cliffside with an opening carved into the rock. The entrance was marked with the same symbols as the boxes, glowing faintly in the dim light. This was it, the end of the trail. The air inside was cold and damp, and the walls were lined with strange markings that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the earth until I reached a vast underground chamber. And there in the center was something I'll never forget. It was a machine, enormous and otherworldly, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols. The air around it seemed alive, humming with energy. The boxes in my hands began to vibrate, their glow intensifying as I approached. I placed the boxes on a platform near the base of the machine. As soon as they touched it, the symbols on the boxes began to rearrange themselves, aligning with those on the machine. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and the entire structure came to life. Lights flickered on, illuminating the room in an eerie glow. Screens on the walls displayed incomprehensible data, lines of symbols and diagrams that looked like a mix of mathematics and madness. And then, from somewhere deep within the machine, a voice spoke. You have brought them back. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it filled the chamber like a roar. I froze, my hand instinctively going to my rifle. Who's there? There was no answer, only the voice again. You have returned what was lost. The cycle can begin anew. What cycle? I shouted. What the hell is this? The machine didn't answer. Instead, a series of images flashed across the screens. People, places, events, things I didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. It was like watching history itself unfold, but not any history I'd ever learned. Then the images stopped, replaced by a single phrase written in the glowing symbols. Containment breach imminent. That's when I heard it. a deep, guttural growl echoing from the far side of the chamber. My blood ran cold as I turned to see a shadowy form emerging from the darkness. It wasn't like the shadows that had chased us before. This was solid, massive, and very, very real. The creature stepped into the light, its body a twisted amalgamation of flesh and metal, its eyes glowing with the same light as the symbols. It let out another growl, and I knew I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my rifle and fired, the shots echoing through the chamber. The bullets hit, but they didn't slow it down. It charged, its movements unnervingly fast for something its size. I barely managed to dive out of the way as it crashed into the platform, sending sparks and debris flying. The machine's voice returned, calm and detached. Containment failure. Emergency protocols engaged. The platform holding the boxes began to sink into the floor, disappearing into the machine. The creature roared, its attention shifting toward the boxes. That was my chance. I scrambled to my feet and ran, weaving through the maze of machinery and rubble. The creature's footsteps thundered behind me, each one shaking the ground. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get out. Then, just as I reached the tunnel leading back to the surface, I heard another voice. Over here. I turned to see Rodriguez standing at the edge of the chamber, his rifle raised. Relief and confusion washed over me in equal measure. "What are you doing here?" I shouted. "Saving your ash," he yelled back. "Now move." He opened fire on the creature, the shots drawing its attention away from me. I didn't waste the opportunity. I ran toward him, my legs burning with every step. As I reached him, he tossed me a grenade. "Make it count," he said. I didn't hesitate. Pulling the pin, I hurled the grenade toward the creature. It exploded on impact, the blast shaking the entire chamber. The creature let out a deafening roar, but it didn't fall. Instead, it staggered back, giving us just enough time to escape. We didn't stop running until we were back in the forest, the sound of the machine's hum fading into the distance. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, Rodriguez looked at me, his expression a mix of anger and relief. "You owe me an explanation," he said. "You'll get one," I replied, clutching my knees to catch my breath. "But first, we need to figure out what the hell we just unleashed."